Even her kids are fake produce, it turns out.
Well, yeah,
we don't know
looks
that.
like they could be.
There's a particular kind of unease that arises when a story polished to perfection begins to unravel, not because of scandalous revelations but because of tiny cracks that start to show through the glossy surface. This was exactly the unsettling feeling that crept into public consciousness when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle emerged, glowing and proud, to share the news of their baby boy Archie. For countless royal watchers, those earliest moments were meant to be reassuring, the next chapter in the familiar tale of continuity and tradition. But instead, the first signs suggested that this wouldn't be a story unfolding quite like the ones before it. Months before Archie's arrival, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had presented the image of a modern, affectionate partnership. Photographers captured Meghan's smiling face as she cradled her growing belly. Commentators praised Harry for his protective demeanor and warmth. From the outside, it seemed this young family intended to blend heritage with a spirit of progress, a union of time-honored monarchy and fresh independence. But away from the smiling photographs and official statements, more complicated realities were taking shape. It all began to feel askew on the morning of May 6, 2019, when Buckingham Palace issued what many assumed was a routine announcement. The Duchess had gone into labor. Harry was reportedly present, sharing in the final hours before their child was born. Journalists and royal correspondents scrambled to prepare, setting up their positions for the anticipated press call and the now iconic photograph of the royal parents emerging to greet a waiting nation. Yet just a few hours later, an additional statement was released, confirming that Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor had been safely delivered. For a brief moment, there was collective celebration. But then, the timelines began to look peculiar. The official communication that Meghan had entered labor was distributed in the early afternoon, after 2 p.m. However, once government records were made public, they revealed the baby had been born well before dawn, around 5:30 in the morning. To some, this was an inconsequential slip, a delay in notifying the media, or a logistical misstep. But in the royal household, where procedure is the bedrock of trust, even small inconsistencies can echo loudly. First, those discrepancies were shrugged off as harmless. Perhaps the palace simply needed time to gather the family, to coordinate statements, to confirm every detail before releasing the information to the world. But as the hours passed, observers who had studied the Windsor family for decades began to wonder if there was something more behind this uncharacteristic departure from routine. When Archie's birth certificate was filed more than a week later, it confirmed that Meghan had given birth at the Portland Hospital, a discreet and exclusive London clinic known for its capacity to protect the privacy of elite patients. On paper, that should have been the end of it, but by then, curiosity had already bloomed into something more persistent. Why hadn't the location been shared right away? Why hadn't photographers caught even a glimpse of the Duchess entering or leaving the facility? Where was the cherished image of the beaming parents holding their baby on the front steps? The moment that connects the present to the past. Comparison to Diana, standing beneath the Lindo Wing's blue awning cradling baby William, or to Kate, smiling with George in her arms, was inevitable. Those images had become part of a national tradition, touchstones that reassured the public that, however modern these young royals might be, they still honored the rituals of the crown. Harry and Meghan, however, chose to step away from that script entirely. And while they were entitled to make that decision, the gap they left behind created a space where doubt could flourish. Veteran royal correspondents, some of whom had covered births and milestones for nearly half a century, were among the first to voice apprehension. They noticed how tightly the Sussexes controlled access, how determined they seemed to avoid the press at every turn. Even Archie's introduction was handled privately, in an intimate setting inside Windsor Castle rather than outside a hospital. In the photograph released to the public, Harry held the baby while Meghan stood beside him, their expressions soft and composed. It was, in many ways, a beautiful image, but it didn't feel like the final piece of the puzzle. Instead, it left an unfinished impression, a sense that something essential had been withheld. When an audience senses an omission, the instinct is to look closer, and if no answers emerge, to start speculating. Almost immediately, theories erupted online. Some declared that Meghan had never actually been pregnant, that she had turned to a surrogate and hidden the fact with careful statements and private agreements. Others insisted that Archie had been born elsewhere, or earlier than reported, or in circumstances the palace was unwilling to reveal. These claims found fertile ground in the confusion over the timing and the absence of familiar rituals. Although many of the more extreme allegations were quickly debunked, the conversation had already shifted. What began as curiosity soon calcified into skepticism. And for Harry and Meghan, who were already locked in conflict with much of the media, the moment felt like a confirmation of everything they feared, that their private milestones would be turned into public battlegrounds. Still, when the birth certificate became public, it seemed poised to settle the debate once and for all. The document was straightforward, detailing the date, the time, and the place of Archie's arrival. Meghan was listed formally, Rachel Meghan, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex, and her occupation noted as Princess of the United Kingdom, in keeping with the royal convention that had been applied to Diana decades earlier. But in a climate of suspicion, even ordinary details took on an outsized significance. Was the title an assertion of status? An oversight by the registrar? An intentional flourish to solidify Meghan's position? Palace assured the public that everything was perfectly standard. To those inclined to mistrust, the explanations rang hollow. To most casual observers, it was easy to wonder why any of it mattered. A healthy baby had been born to two loving parents. Surely the precise hour of the announcement or the hospital's name was trivial in comparison. But the reality is that in the royal family, appearances carry the weight of continuity. When familiar patterns are disrupted, questions multiply. And in the vacuum created by Harry and Meghan's silence, rumors grew unchecked. The media was a powerful accelerant. Serious publications tried to interpret the couple's actions with nuance, portraying them as an attempt to carve out a sphere of peace in the glare of relentless attention. But tabloids were eager to push more scandalous narratives, resurrecting old video clips and blurry photographs in an effort to prove that Meghan's pregnancy was a fabrication. Shots of her adjusting her clothing or bending to pick something up were replayed again and again, scrutinized for any sign that the bump was artificial. Whether these illusions were caused by camera angles or flowing fabric seemed not to matter. What mattered was the suggestion of something hidden. Despite all the noise, no reputable outlet ever produced credible evidence that the pregnancy had been staged. Independent reviews confirmed that the birth certificate matched the hospital's records, that the timeline aligned with private accounts from staff, and that the official statements were accurate, if delayed. But in an era when repetition often trumps verification, rumors proved impossible to extinguish. Palace's decision to refrain from further comment only deepened the sense that there were still pieces missing. And so the questions kept returning. What does it mean to belong to an institution that depends so heavily on tradition? Who decides which customs must endure and which may be left behind? For Harry, defending his wife from an environment he felt was poisonous took precedence over satisfying centuries-old expectations. For Meghan, controlling her story meant refusing to play by rules she saw as archaic. But the effect was the same. A blank space that no amount of official documentation could ever quite fill. In the years that followed, that empty space in the narrative grew to define much of how the world perceived the Sussexes. Each time Harry and Meghan resurfaced, whether through documentaries, interviews, or speeches, the lingering doubts about Archie's birth re-emerged. It was as though time had no power to soften or erase those early questions. Instead, every new public appearance seemed to breathe life back into them. Some of this was the inevitable consequence of modern celebrity. In an earlier era, a royal statement or photograph would have been accepted as the final word. But social media has transformed the landscape. Now, a single inconsistency can become a viral obsession overnight, dissected by thousands of anonymous commentators, each eager to find hidden meaning in every gesture or phrase. That relentless scrutiny, more than anything else, revealed the paradox at the heart of Harry and Meghan's story. Their desire for privacy collided with a public that had been trained over generations to expect total access. Even their most personal milestones were never truly their own. And the more they tried to hold the details close, the more those details were demanded of them. Perhaps the most striking example of this was Archie's christening. Like the birth, it was handled in a manner that broke with precedent. The ceremony was private, attended only by family and a few close friends. The guest list was not released in full. Only a pair of carefully curated photographs were shared afterward. One formal portrait in the green drawing room of Windsor Castle, the other a more intimate image of the new family. For some, the pictures were enough. a reminder that this was, after all, a personal event, not a performance. But for others, they were proof that the couple had no intention of honoring the openness traditionally expected of senior royals. The reaction was predictably divided. Admirers praised the Sussexes for asserting boundaries in the face of an unforgiving media culture. Critics accused them of hypocrisy, pointing out that they continued to accept public funding for their household even as they denied the public access to moments long considered part of the royal bargain. In newspapers and online forums alike, the debate raged on, louder and more polarized than ever. To those inside the palace, the entire saga became an object lesson in the perils of rejecting tradition. Senior aides had warned that the public would not easily forgive the absence of the hospital steps photo, the opaque birth timeline, the private christening, but Harry and Meghan believed they were protecting their son from the scrutiny that had haunted them both. They had no desire to offer him up as the latest spectacle for a media machine they felt had already done irreparable harm. They hoped the controversy would eventually burn itself out. They were mistaken. In fact, each new milestone in their lives seemed only to renew interest in the circumstances of Archie's arrival. When they announced their decision to step back from royal duties, commentators revisited the birth story as an early sign that the couple never intended to remain within the confines of palace life. When they gave interviews about feeling unsupported and attacked, skeptics pointed again to those first weeks, arguing that the secrecy had always been about control rather than self-preservation. The reality, of course, was more nuanced. For Harry, the trauma of his mother's death had shaped every instinct. He could still recall the flashing cameras outside the hospital, the relentless reporters who chased Diana to her grave. To him, shielding his wife and child was not a calculated rebellion, it was an obligation. For Meghan, who had been catapulted from relative anonymity to global notoriety in a matter of months, the idea of maintaining any private space must have felt essential to her sanity. Yet in a family that operates on ceremony and symbolism, even good intentions can look like defiance. And so, as the couple charted their own course, each choice became a referendum on their loyalty to the institution itself. Observers have often pointed out that the monarchy thrives on ritual because ritual creates certainty. When the public knows what to expect, when milestones unfold according to a predictable pattern, there is less room for suspicion. The birth of a royal baby is not simply a family event. It is a state occasion, steeped in the expectations of centuries. To deviate from that script is to invite questions that will never fully be answered. Over time, the debate about Archie's birth took on a life of its own, becoming less about facts and more about what people wanted to believe. For some, the story was evidence that the Sussexes were misunderstood visionaries, determined to modernize an outdated system. For others, it was proof that they were unwilling to honor the unspoken contract between royalty and the public. In either case, the truth became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the narrative each person had already decided upon. And so, even years later, the subject remains strangely potent. Every time Harry and Meghan release a new project or speak publicly about their experiences, the same questions resurface, as if no time has passed at all. The internet dredges up old headlines and grainy photographs. The same arguments played out again and again in an endless loop. It's tempting to think that all of this will eventually fade. That, in time, the arrival of Archie will become just another line in the long history of the Windsor family. But something about the episode feels different, more emblematic of how celebrity and monarchy have merged in the modern age. In earlier generations, the palace could dictate the terms of public engagement. Now, the audience plays an equal role in shaping the narrative. Every omission becomes a prompt for speculation. Every deviation from tradition is interpreted through the lens of suspicion. For the Sussexes, this dynamic has been both a burden and, at times, a source of strength. Their ability to control their own story, to speak directly to the public through interviews, documentaries, and social media, has allowed them to counter the narratives they find most damaging. But it has also ensured that the scrutiny never fully abates. Because once a question is asked loudly enough, no amount of explanation can erase it completely. In many ways, the story of Archie's birth was the first real test of the couple's vision for their public life. It revealed how difficult it would be to balance their desire for independence with the expectations that came with their titles. And it showed, more than anything, that even the most personal moments can be transformed into symbols of a much larger struggle. Looking back, it's easy to wonder whether a single gesture, a brief appearance on the hospital steps, a few words to the waiting press, might have changed everything. Perhaps it would have quieted the speculation, reassured the skeptics, and allowed the family to move forward without the shadow of unanswered questions. Or perhaps it would only have delayed the inevitable reckoning that was to come. Because in the end, the birth of Archie was never just about one baby. It was about the collision between centuries of tradition and the realities of a world where every story is contested, every narrative dissected. It was about the limits of privacy in an age of unending curiosity, and the impossibility of satisfying everyone when the stakes are so high. Even now, as Archie grows older and his parents continue to chart their own course, the conversation lingers. It has become part of the Sussex legacy, a reminder that no matter how carefully you try to protect your story, it will always belong partly to the public. In that sense, their experience is not unique. It is the same paradox that has haunted every member of the royal family for generations: the knowledge that your life is never entirely your own. Perhaps with time, the questions will lose their potency. Perhaps people will grow tired of rehashing the same theories and move on to new controversies. Or perhaps this will remain one of those rare moments that never truly recedes into history. A riddle without a definitive solution, an episode destined to be revisited again and again. If there is any lesson to be drawn from all of this, it is that the monarchy's reliance on ritual and precedent is not merely about preserving an image. It is about creating a framework in which the public can trust that, even when the details are imperfect, the larger story is stable. When that framework is disrupted, even with the best of intentions, the consequences are often impossible to predict. Harry and Meghan's choice to do things differently was, in many ways, entirely understandable. But it also showed just how deeply people feel invested in the traditions that define royal life. When those traditions are set aside, it can feel like a personal affront, a rejection of something shared and cherished. And so, the birth of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor became more than the arrival of a beloved child. It became a mirror reflecting the tensions at the heart of the modern monarchy. A reminder that even the smallest deviations can become the stuff of legend. No matter how much time passes, that story will likely continue to echo. 'Cause in the end, this was never simply about a baby or a press release or a missing photograph. It was about the timeless question that every royal must confront. How do you honor the past while trying to build something new?